Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sire here today to discuss with you our final two parts of our civil rights module that we've been doing this half term. If you haven't already, do make sure you go back and check out our previous videos, especially the more recent ones since 1945 into the 1960s. And they're the ones we're going to be mostly concerning ourselves with today in this video lesson. This will be the first of a two-part lesson to wrap things up here. This one's going to focus on another change over time essay style question you may face at GCSE and or A level. And this is going to focus between 1945 and 1965. And much like the one we did wrapping things up just before the Second World War, this one is going to explore change. And now rather than just the extent of change, we're actually going to find out who is going to be most responsible for change occurring in this shorter timeline. The second video in this concluding series will focus on the historiography surrounding Martin Luther King Jr. and the extent historians debate whether it's convincing or not convincing to say that he is the main reason for civil rights progress in this era. So, with all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So as I said, this is going to be a change essay, but it's also going to be what's called a factor essay as well. So factors are things that we can point to as causes for something to have happened. So the key idea we're looking at here is progression of African American civil rights. And principally the timeline we always want to focus on is between 1945 and 1965. So all the knowledge we've gathered across our video series, we can now bring in to include within these videos, to include in this essay to some extent. Now, four potential factors we can look at, as I've outlined on the screen here, we can look at specific leaders in the civil rights movement. Look at King, Randolph, Marshall, maybe others like James, or maybe even bring in some black power leaders like Malcolm X, for example, and maybe the rising of Stokely Carmichael. There are also other things we can look at as well, particularly the federal government and the presidents who use their executive powers to try and enforce change and bring awareness to civil rights and try and do their best, their position of power they were given by the electorate to make some change for the African American civil rights as well. A third factor will be grassroots activism. For those of you who did my World War One essays and so forth, we don't want to get wrapped up in the idea of great men history. We want to actually widen the idea that history can come from below. It can come from the people. And in this case, it can come from our grassroots movements like SNCC, CORE, SCLC, the NAACP, and maybe you want to bring in the latter half of the Brothers of Sleeping Car Porters. Maybe there's a way to bring in Nation of Islam. And it's how you want to change the essay to adapt for yourself what you want to focus on. Grassroots could be a key factor all the same. And the fourth and final factor we can consider is the media, how the rise of television, radio, publicity of all the campaigns that were happening, especially Birmingham and Washington into the 1960s. Could that be a reason for civil rights progress? Did that cause change? It's all good, these so-called great men doing their speeches, doing their rallies, doing their orders, but the media doesn't publicize it to the wider electorate in America. Then what's the point? If people aren't made aware of these things happening, then how can their impact truly be great, truly be responsible? So maybe the media could be a key factor we can look at as well. And when you do an essay question for this, you could lay it out in the way I have done here. You could have one paragraph for civil rights leaders, one for the presidents, one for activism, and one for the media. And of course, take it each in turn and then come to a conclusion at the end, which one you believe was the most responsible for that. And ways to improve this decision making, improve this judgment you can make as historians is to use criteria questions. So I'll give a few examples of three of those. So when you're choosing a factor, did it really cause the most change? When you were to level them up with the other factors and comparing and contrasting them, did this factor actually show lots of change happen solely because or mostly because of their actions? Another way to help measure this is to actually consider what change did they cause. So you think back to our change essay we did just before the Second World War. We actually saw that change could go through a number of different themes: political change, cultural change, social change, and economic change. So if you were to measure the change that these four factors caused against those four themes, was there one where they had a greater benefit, like for political rights? Was there one they didn't really give much change for, like maybe the economics? And then it's over to you then to decide which one you value more. So if one factor made lots of political change, but one made lots of economic change, which one would you say was stronger because of that? Or would you say actually we can go for this third factor that got lots of little change for all of our themes, all of our political, social, cultural, and economic progress? And the final bit of criteria you can use, was it proactive or reactive to events? So was this factor one that only took action because of something that came before? Well, if that was the case, maybe the thing that came before deserves greater responsibility because it caused this later thing to happen. And this is also why our timeline is so important. So a final thing you can consider is, was it short or long term action? So were there bits of action done throughout the timeline, or was it a constant presence throughout, where it was clearly enacting change throughout the timeline rather than just for one big event in the middle or the end or the beginning and never ever again? So there's some things to think about. And again, as you're going through your paragraphs, you can start to bring in these ideas, bring in this criteria, and measure the factor against it. So when you get to that conclusive judgment paragraph, you can just bring it all together, link those lines, and make that clear decision, make that judgment for yourself. So that's the overview. That's a structure you can potentially follow. So let's go about the content now. What kind of things can we include? And again, really keeping it as tight as we can to 1945 and 1965, because examiners will be very, very peculiar on this. If they've given you the date, 45 to 65, they want you to stick within that date. You might be okay with one or 2 years out in some of the knowledge of reference, but if you're, as an example, referencing the Enforcement Acts of the 1870s as a sign of presidential change, there's not really there'll be no marks really to give for that, because that's nearly 100 years before this timeline even ends. With that said, let's get ourselves into the factors. So let's look at the actual leaders. What leaders were there, and did they commit any sort of prominent actions? Well, one, as we said already, was Martin Luther King, and he does indeed have a prominent presence in the later half of this timeline, particularly at Montgomery in 1956-57 during the bus boycott. We should remember with Rosa Parks and her actions she did. This Baptist minister of a young 26-year-old was chosen. He took part in the campaigning. He got on TV. He's the one delivering the speeches advocating their cause. And he's a constant presence in the 60s as well. He was there at Albany. While not a brilliant success, it laid the groundwork for the thing that came after. And then he really became quite prominent in Birmingham and Selma later on, which, as we know, were things that caused actions to occur and forced the executive orders to come through to get the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 to be passed as well. So already some clear action we could point to Martin Luther King, and again because he was the one who got the president's attention, President Kennedy's attention at that time. But there are other leaders as well. There's obviously Philip Randolph. He, of course, organized marches. He did the one back in 1942. But for this timeline, he also is still very relevant in organizing the March of 1963, the March on Washington, and therefore all the events that happened there, going to the Lincoln Memorial, gathering hundreds of thousands of people, ensuring the speeches and the music were heard, ensuring it was put on national television all around the nation. A lot of that can be given to him, and so it's a key thing he did. We should make sure we remember. Then, of course, through that, we had some key speeches. We had John Lewis's speech about how he wanted change now, not change gradually. And then Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, where he called for freedom to be free at last. And that's why he wanted to have the true equality achieved between African Americans and white Americans. So, again, some key speeches that need leadership, that they embody this sense of change that was being shown. We also have James Farmer's Sittings and Freedom Rides he orchestrated with CORE. So again, some key action that he's been doing as well. And he, of course, is getting involved in the media, giving his speeches and advocating his cause. And a key thing these leaders did, which we should remember, is that March on Washington, where they came together, they united their cause, and showed, despite some frictions that were shown at Albany, they also could come together and show some clear unity as well. These are just some examples. You may want to bring in other leaders as well. Perhaps one we've not studied as much, or maybe the more recently experienced Malcolm X, his actions with speech making in the north of the states for criticizing ghetto poverty, you can make reference to as well. So there are other leaders, and it's very important in this leadership essay that you choose a leader you want to really emphasize and focus on. Again, I've just given a few ideas here. Perhaps when you do the essay, you may give those few ideas. You may choose one to focus on. Perhaps Martin Luther King, given his wide presence across the timeline. But again, it's good to give a variation because you want to fill that timeline. And you've got a narrow one to work with here, 45 to 65. So you can have a couple of leaders to show that this leadership action is spread across the timeline. You will gather more marks for showing a breadth as well as depth of knowledge. The next factor you could consider are the presidents and the federal government at large and the things they were trying to do for civil rights. Now, in this timeline, there were four key presidents that we had experienced. First was Truman. We should remember his actions to secure these rights, and how he passed executive orders to attempt to desegregate the U.S. Armed Forces. Remember, he had that whole agenda put in place. He wanted some change. He really was reacting to the things that happened to Isaac Woodward, those who were the veterans who were attacked after they came back from the war. And despite his southern origins in Missouri, he still understood the need for change and wanted to help and assist in that. And then we have that how that carries on. It wasn't just a one president wonder. We have more presidents doing things as well. We have Eisenhower, who carries on Truman's desegregation and finally gets all of the armed forces fully integrated. We have the appointment of Earl Warren to the Supreme Court, and his Warren Court is very, very liberal and is very, very supportive of many civil rights actions. We have the Little Rock crisis, their assistance in that regard. There are constant actions that occur in the 1960s during the sit-ins, during the Freedom Rise, and of course during the marches and so forth. So the Warren Court is quite a long-lasting one. And so in terms of federal change, we could point to that as well. We also have Kennedy as well, who came to support Martin Luther King and promised the passing of that civil rights bill. He assisted during the Birmingham arrest in 1963 and also really commended what had happened with the March on Washington later that year. Then we have Johnson, who, for all the presidents here, is the one who finally got lots of significant legislation passed, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act most prominently. It's worth noting this is the most any president's done since the days of Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant, so about 100 years before. So there's a lot of progress quite clearly that Johnson's shown here. We can't overlook that. We have to understand this is a lot that was done. Johnson can be given a lot of credit for that. But with this factor, I think you can point to some very clear limitations. For instance, Truman and Kennedy were hindered by Dixiecrat resistance in the South. Again, they were Democrats and they relied heavily upon those southern states to help them. But as we saw throughout our module, the southern states always stayed one step back. They were embedded with Jim Crow tradition and Jim Crow segregation. And so when these two presidents came in wanting to secure these rights and pass civil rights bills, they heavily resisted it, especially Kennedy. Kennedy was a Northern Democrat after all, and he only narrowly won the 1960 election. And he won a lot of those Southern votes over because of his prior record of being against civil rights, for instance, voting against the 1957 Civil Rights Bill. And so I could point that as a clear limitation of these two presidents. I mean, Truman, especially, as well as we should remember, never finished fully desegregating the US Armed Forces. He started it, yes, but he never finished it. So that, of course, shows some clear limitation for him trying to get change quickly and efficiently for civil rights. Similar can be said for Eisenhower. He was a Republican and quite moderate, believing in dynamic conservatism, but he was quite a reactive president. He did what he could to stay out of civil rights events as best he could. We, of course, know with the Little Rock crisis, yes, he sent the US Armed Forces in the end, but he had to be prompted by the constant resistance, by the media showing the images of these poor African American children being attacked in the streets, having bricks thrown at them. So there clearly was limits with him. And then, of course, Johnson was very heavily hindered by the loss of the southern states that happened for him, which hindered long-term success. Yes, fair enough. Our timeline doesn't consider what happened in the years after 1965, but we do know there was a clear slowdown in momentum, and you can certainly point out the lack of de facto progress as well. Yes, he got lots of de jure, lots of lawful change. Again, the most of any president we've seen in many, many years. But that actual change on the ground was going to be gradual, take potentially generations to truly change. So there's clear limitations to what the president and the federal government can actually achieve. Our third factor is the grassroots activism that occurred as well. Because again, we can get fixated on on the great men of history and the key leaders. Let's focus now on the actual groups that took part. Core, of course, was campaigning constantly and using integrated action while whites and African Americans on interstate travel, using the Freedom Rise to help reveal the racism of the southern states, how they would firebomb their trucks, how they would harass them, how they would throw bricks at them, and again really show that clear racism to the wider world. We have SNCC's success as well with the Greensboro sittings, and now we have a youth movement now. It's not just older, middle class African Americans who are doing this, it's the youth as well, students who can get involved and advocate for their cause as well. So there's a clear generational breadth to the civil rights movement that can't be understated. We have the SCLC as well. In Martin Luther King, he was just one man, but this group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, gave him that support he needed throughout his campaign, not just in Montgomery, but later on in Birmingham and Selma especially, proving it was a strong movement and could achieve great change. And we know it did achieve great change because when we had them come together in Birmingham, we had the students who were being fire hosed, we had Martin Luther King's speech, we had the SCLC's marches in the streets. So there clearly was a lot of change that could be gained. And the NAACP is providing litigation challenge as well across the timeline. We have Thurgood Marshall's actions in Brown v. Topeka. We, of course, have Milton Keynes. We have Bowder v. Gale. There's a lot of stuff we can make note of there. And perhaps the best part of all about these civil rights groups is they demonstrated a massive movement of support when they came together in Washington 1963. A very monumental event that today is still a strong part of America's popular memory. But there are indeed some limitations to grassroots activism. Again, they do have incidents where they struggle to work together. Albany in 1962 is the clearest example. And if you like, you could make reference to how these frictions remain. You have the Nation of Islam with Malcolm X, who continues to provide some resistance and challenge to Martin Luther King's leadership. And this, of course, sows the seeds for how SNCC and CORE will eventually become radicalized, which you could make mention to towards the end of 1965. Again, kind of maybe alluding to the Meredith March that would come soon after, and all the problems and the division that would come into the civil rights movement. How, despite their show of unity, it was not permanent and indeed could be separated later on. And we also have to understand that change remains gradual as well. There were very, very minimal gains until the early 1960s. And again, it's how you want to judge the change they actually achieve. Yes, they get themselves out in the media. Yes, they do get some successful campaigns. But in terms of that de facto change, where they just get rid and where they overturn the deep-seated racism in the southern states especially, did they really achieve that? Is that really done by 1965? That's something for you to consider. And of course, the geography. We talk a lot about the southern states there. But what about the northern states? Are they achieving any change? Or actually, is that a neglected front? If the timeline was a little bit wider, would reveal was a deep flaw in the civil rights movement. And the fourth and final factor you could consider is the media. Now, the media is a very important one because there's a lot of ways that it can take. It's basically the news, as we discussed. It's the news, it's television, it's radio, it's understanding that these are the things that people, the average civilian, will see in their life. And so these images that they get are what's going to be really important to them. And so by publicizing these key events to the Americans and the wider world, they're therefore going to have a massive impact. And so what the media does is they force presidents to confront these issues that are previously ignored. Well, it's very important how you want to set it up in your essay with this factor. You can make a big case that, for instance, the March on Washington was only really successful because the cameras were there to capture it all. The Iowa Dream speech is only so famous because the media was capturing it and made sure it was seen. Same for other things like the Little Rock crisis, Montgomery bus boycott. You have to really assess to yourself the extent that these events are so famous because the media allows them to be seen. For instance, the horrible treatment of African Americans in places like Montgomery, Little Rock, and Birmingham during the Freedom Ride is visible because of television. Those fire bombings, they were only seen because they're on TV. The students being hosed down by police, they're only seen because they're now put on TV. So it's important to really make that decision for yourself. Is that really what helps them? Is that really the reason that progress is made? And there might be a way to say, well, yeah, it's causing things to happen. It's causing leaders to become well known. It's causing presidents to pass legislation. And so, because these events the graphic movements are doing are published on TV, that's what makes them so famous and cause for clear change. Although, again, it could be reversed. You could say the media actually at times going against the civil rights movements. For instance, their support was lost, like at Albany, because they actually because they showcased the opposite rather than showcasing the civil rights leaders in a positive light. In that occasion, they showed Laurie Pritchett and the police were quite calm, quite orderly, and therefore actually supported their image instead. And that's the thing, like the image changed depending on what the media presents to the wider people. They also are quite reactive. The media itself are not the ones calling for change or making change happen. They simply show people in America the change that is happening. So, because they're reacting to the events, you actually need the leaders to do their speeches. You need the politicians to pass legislation. You need the grassroots activists to go out and campaign. At the end of the day, if they don't do that, the media has no story to publish, nothing to say. So the media, maybe it's really on that angle, just an empty vessel that people can use for their benefit, rather than media in and of itself being the thing that causes change. And we also see how this changes across the timeline. In the 1940s and early 50s, not a lot of people had access to televisions. They would have had radios by this time, but televisions were new, they were novel. And so it's only by the mid 60s, lots more people have got access to them, and we can say there's a clear avenue for change there. So, again, in terms of the timeline, maybe it's actually only important at certain points when people have access to the technology and when key events like Birmingham, like Montgomery, like the March on Washington are actually happening. So it's a very interesting factor, this one, and it all comes down to how you want to interpret it. And so now we're going to bring it to a close and consider how we would judge these factors and close our essay when we reach this point. So you imagine you've done all four of your factors now, you've considered your criteria, considered key time points, and considered key events. And you have to ask yourself, which factor do you think was most responsible for the change in African American civil rights between 1945 and 1965? And this is where your criteria is so important. You have to ask yourself, was the factor present throughout the timeline? Was it only at certain points? And then how would you then weigh it up? Was it an event or was it an individual who stood out as causing change the most? So, for instance, you could initially say it's Martin Luther King Jr. So he's there in the mid 50s up to the mid 60s doing a lot of action. But is he actually the one making success? He's not really a key figure after the Second World War for about 10 years. And he has got some setbacks. Albany was a clear setback for him. And between Montgomery and Birmingham, what did he really do? Was there any real key actions there that caused change? Is it linchpin events that really make things happen? Or is it the constant effort of these activists or of the civil rights leaders to actually achieve the change they are seeking to make? And so again, it's up to you. There's no right or wrong answer, as long as you back it up with clear context and use those key criteria to help prove your point that you're making. But of course, you can always take this further as well. I have got a couple of potential other questions you could consider. So one was very similar to the one we did up to the start of the Second World War, which is to what extent was there clear signs of improvement in the lives of African Americans between 45 and 65? Between 1945 and 1965. We looked here at cause of change, but what actually was the real change they had? So again, you can go back to your political, social, and economic themes and really explore them and the extent that these things caused meaningful change for each of those themes. Or you can even widen the timeline. Again, as I've said, we are actually at the end of our content here. We have done up to the 1970s, so you could maybe want to expand it that way. You could even want to go even further back to the start of our timelines in 1917, or even further back and do a really long breadth essay as well. But these kind of ideas are what's constantly going to be asked about. And you may face similar things. It's always about cause, it's always about change, and maybe it can be about comparison and difference as well. So you've got to really understand that. Again, you can even change the question. I've done here who's most responsible for change, but it could go the other way. Who did the most to limit change? So again, considering the content we learned in our prior lessons to finish the module, the Black Power movement, that actually turned the white moderates away from wanting change, and therefore is that limiting things that happen. Again, it's how you want to frame it. And again, it all depends on the question, which context you can bring in and therefore use to benefit your answers. But with all that said, we reached the end of this essay video. I hope you found it useful. I hope you found it quite insightful. And I think it's good for us to bring our knowledge together and make sure we understood some key changes that happen. Again, there's some things I've not mentioned here that have been in our videos, so do go back and check out my videos again to help you revise that content and prepare yourselves for this change or factor essay you could potentially face. As always, do leave some comments below if you like. And of course, again, that engagement is always appreciated. What you found most useful about this essay video. Would you like more of these things to help you out? Would you want me to go through a different style essay? Maybe that comparison and difference. Again, it's entirely up to you. I'm happy to cater to what you, the students, truly need. But with all that said, we've only got one more video to go, which will be the Martin Luther King historiography essay. So do make sure you're subscribed and you're liking and commenting to make sure you keep track and are ready for when that releases. This has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.